Welcome, vision seekers, dreamers, and lovers of history's greatest legends. Today, you and I embark on a journey that transcends the boundaries of time. A journey into the heart of a man whose name echoes through eternity. Alexander the Great. This is not simply a tale of conquest. It is the dream of a boy who became a king, of a warrior who sought to unite the world, of a visionary whose ambition burned brighter than any flame. His path was marked by courage and betrayal, triumph and tragedy, wisdom and relentless desire. As you watch this story unfold, imagine the dust of ancient battlefields rising around you, the clash of swords ringing in your ears, the endless horizons that lured Alexander ever further east. Imagine the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders, a destiny he embraced not for himself alone, but for the ages. Together, we will walk beside him. We will witness his victories, his struggles, and the dream that shaped the course of civilization. Prepare yourself, for this is more than history. This is the immortal journey of Alexander the Great. What if your destiny was written before your first breath? What if a dream whispered to you, a dream so powerful it demanded the conquest of the world? Alexander was not just a man. He was a storm wrapped in human form. In his heart lived a fire that no kingdom could contain. He dreamed of empires, of glory, of immortality, and that dream would change the world forever. Subscribe for more history, like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth, this is history. And it begins here, long before he became the Great. Alexander was a boy of restless spirit in the palace of Pella. One night, he awoke from a dream so vivid, so haunting, that it would guide his every step. In that dream, he stood upon a vast plain, golden sunlight, pouring from the heavens. Before him stretched lands without end, cities glittering like jewels, rivers flowing like silver veins through the earth, and a voice, deep, commanding, eternal, whispered, "Alexander, the world awaits your hand. Take it." The young prince's eyes opened to darkness, but his soul remained filled with light. He believed this vision was not mere fantasy, but destiny itself. He shared it with his mother, Olympias, who told him he was born not of man alone, but of gods. His father, King Philip, saw in him a spark of greatness that could outshine all Macedonia. From that night onward, Alexander carried the dream like a weapon at his side. Every lesson, every horse he tamed, every scroll he studied under Aristotle became fuel for the fire within him. He was no longer a child of Macedonia. He was heir to a vision as vast as the sky itself. Pella, the capital of Macedonia, was alive with music, markets, and the clashing of warriors training in the courtyards. Within its walls grew a boy unlike any other Alexander. Even as a child, he showed no patience for idle games. Where other children played, Alexander sought challenges that would test his body and sharpen his mind. Stories tell of the boy who could not bear to see weakness, neither in himself nor in others. Once, while playing with his friends, he saw them struggle to lift a heavy stone. Laughing, he stepped forward and lifted it with determination. His young muscles strained, sweat poured from his brow. Yet he would not give up. The other children cheered. And in that moment, Alexander learned the power of perseverance. His mother, Olympias, fed him stories of Achilles, the great hero of Troy. She whispered that he was descended from gods, destined for glory. His father, Philip II, often tested him with questions about war and politics. Alexander listened keenly, his young mind absorbing every word. In the gardens of Pella, he often spoke aloud to himself, imagining battles against unseen enemies. commanding armies only he could see. He was not content to simply be a prince. He was preparing to be a conqueror. As Alexander grew, his father Philip sought the finest teacher for him. He chose none other than Aristotle, the great philosopher, whose wisdom stretched beyond Greece itself. In the shaded groves of Mieza, Alexander and a group of noble youths sat beneath olive trees, listening as Aristotle spoke of ethics, logic, science, and the nature of the world. Aristotle taught him that true greatness was not only in conquering lands, but in mastering the mind. He spoke of balance, of virtue, of the golden mean. Yet Alexander, restless, asked of heroes, gods, and the limits of the earth. If the world has an edge, he asked, what lies beyond it? Aristotle smiled, knowing his pupil was destined to seek that answer with his sword. The philosopher gave him the Iliad, the epic of Achilles, and Alexander carried it with him always, keeping it under his pillow during Achilles became his role model, not only as a warrior, but as a man who sought eternal glory. Through Aristotle's eyes, Alexander learned the art of governance, the sciences of nature, and the philosophy of leadership. Yet in his heart, his dream burned brighter than wisdom, to surpass Achilles, to carve his own name into eternity. One of the most enduring legends of Alexander's youth was his taming of the great horse Bucephalus. A mighty black stallion had been brought before King Philip, offered for a heavy price. Yet no one could ride him. The beast reared, kicked, and terrified even the bravest warriors. The court mocked the horse as useless, but Alexander, still just a boy, watched keenly. He noticed something no one else did. The horse panicked at its own shadow. Boldly, Alexander stepped forward. The courtiers laughed, but he silenced them with a glare. "I will ride him," he declared. He turned the stallion toward the sun, so its shadow fell behind. Whispering soothing words, Alexander stroked Bucephalus's mane, then leapt onto his back. The court gasped as horse and rider surged forward, galloping across the plain. Dust rose like thunder, but instead of falling, Alexander clung firm, guiding the stallion with instinct and courage. When he returned, Bucephalus calm beneath him, the crowd erupted in awe. King Philip wept with pride, declaring, "My son, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." From that day, Bucephalus became Alexander's closest companion in war and glory. Alexander's first taste of battle came while still a teenager. At just 16, Philip left him in charge of Macedonia while he campaigned elsewhere. When rebellious Thracians rose against the crown, Alexander seized the chance to prove himself. Leading a small force of Macedonian soldiers, he rode Bucephalus into battle. The clash of steel and the roar of men filled the air. Though young, Alexander displayed the tactical brilliance that would define his life. He studied the terrain, divided his men, and struck where the enemy least expected. With a war cry that pierced the battlefield, Alexander led the charge. His courage inspired his troops, and together they crushed the rebels. In the aftermath, he founded a city on the conquered land, naming it Alexandropolis, the first to bear his name. The victory spread his reputation across Greece. He was no longer a mere prince, but a warrior and commander in his own right. The dream of destiny was beginning to unfold. Macedonia, once dismissed as a rough land of northern tribes, was rising under King Philip II. Through reforms and relentless ambition, Philip transformed his armies into the most disciplined force in Greece. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissas, spears twice the length of the traditional hoplites' weapon, became an unstoppable wall of iron. Alexander, as crown prince, studied these reforms closely. He trained alongside the men, learning the discipline of the ranks, the weight of armor, and the rhythm of war. Philip's victories against Athens and Thebes made Greece tremble, and Alexander was there, riding at his father's side, absorbing every strategy. Yet Philip's ambition went beyond Greece. His eyes turned east to the Persian Empire, vast and wealthy. The dream of conquering Persia began in his court, whispered in councils, debated among generals. Alexander listened, silent but burning inside. He knew the dream of Persia would one day become his own destiny. Macedon rose from obscurity to dominance, and Alexander's path was being forged in fire. The boy who tamed Bucephalus was now a warrior prince, preparing for empire. Victory had crowned Philip, but fate struck him down at the height of his power. During the grand wedding feast of his daughter Cleopatra, tragedy unfolded. Amid the laughter, music, and wine, Philip strode proudly into the theatre, his crimson cloak trailing behind him. Suddenly, a bodyguard named Pausanias rushed forward with a dagger. Before anyone could react, the blade pierced Philip's chest. The king staggered, blood staining his robes, and collapsed before the horrified crowd. Chaos erupted. Some cried treason. Others fled in terror. Pausanias was cut down immediately, but the deed was done. The king was dead. For Alexander, grief mixed with fire. Though he loved his father, he knew destiny had come for him sooner than expected. At just years old, he was declared king of Macedonia. The nobles swore loyalty. The army lifted their spears in salute. And Olympias whispered, "It is your time." Philip's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Alexander the Prince was gone. Alexander the Great was born. The kingdom of Macedonia was shaken by Philip's assassination. But in the chaos, a new star rose. The army and nobles, bound by loyalty to Philip's bloodline, proclaimed Alexander as king. He was just 20 years old. The coronation was a scene of both mourning and triumph. The palace of Agai, still draped in funeral garlands for Philip, now echoed with chants of Basilius. Basilius, king, king! Alexander entered the hall not as a grieving son, but as a sovereign ready to claim his destiny. His cloak shimmered crimson, his armor gleamed with gold, and in his eyes burned the fire of ambition. Priests anointed him with sacred oils, invoking Zeus and the gods. Olympias stood by his side, her expression fierce, whispering that this was the moment foretold by prophecy. The nobles bent the knee, their heads bowed, while the Macedonian army saluted with a thunderous clash of spears against shields. Yet even in triumph, Alexander understood the peril. His throne was not secure. Rivals plotted, neighboring kingdoms doubted, and distant Persia watched. He vowed silently to crush rebellion, to unite Greece, and to march east where his father's dream awaited. On that day the prince became a king, and the dream became a mission. No sooner had Alexander been crowned than whispers of rebellion spread across Greece. Many cities believed the young king would falter, that he lacked the iron will of his father. Among them, proud Thebes rose in defiance. Thebes, ancient city of heroes, believed it could resist Macedon's might. Marching his army over hundreds of miles. In just days, he appeared at the gates of Thebes, before the rebels had even prepared. The sudden arrival of the Macedonian phalanx struck fear into the Greeks. Yet Thebes, proud and stubborn, refused to yield. The assault began at dawn. Macedonian soldiers stormed the walls, their long sarissas piercing through defenders. Alexander himself led the charge, Bucephalus thundering forward as arrows rained from above. The clash was brutal, the streets of Thebes echoing with the screams of battle. By nightfall, the city was shattered. Alexander ordered Thebes burned to the ground as a warning. Its walls crumbled, its people scattered or enslaved. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, a gesture of respect for culture amidst destruction. The message was clear: defiance against Alexander would mean annihilation. Greece trembled, and within weeks all other cities swore allegiance. The young king had proven he would rule with both brilliance and terror. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned his gaze eastward, toward the Persian Empire, the richest and most powerful dominion the world had ever known. His father's dream of conquering Persia now became his mission. In the spring of Census BCE, Alexander gathered his forces at the Hellespont. The army numbered about Lingman, Macedonian phalanxes, seasoned cavalry, and Greek allies, united under a single banner. Against them stood Persia, a vast empire stretching from Asia Minor to India, commanded by satraps and backed by King Darius III. Before crossing, Alexander performed a sacred ritual. He sailed across the straits, leapt ashore on Asian soil, and cast his spear into the ground. From this land, he declared, "I claim Asia as a gift from the gods." He then visited the ancient ruins of Troy, honoring Achilles, his hero, by laying a wreath upon the hero's tomb. For Alexander, this was not just war but destiny, a continuation of myth. As the army marched through Asia Minor, spirits soared. Soldiers sang of conquest, banners snapped in the wind, and Bucephalus carried his master at the head of the column. The horizon stretched endlessly, but Alexander's resolve was unwavering. He would not stop until he stood over the ruins of Persia's throne. The march to Persia had begun, and with it, the birth of empire. The Persian satraps, alarmed by Alexander's crossing, gathered their forces by the river Granicus. In Asia Minor, army, strong in cavalry, waited on the far bank. Confident, the young Macedonian would not dare to cross a swift river under their gaze. But Alexander thrived where others hesitated. At dawn, with his scarlet cloak streaming, he led his men into the rushing waters. The river churned against their legs, arrows hissed overhead, and Persian cavalry thundered forward to drive them back. Yet the Macedonian phalanx held firm, their long sarissas forming an iron forest. Then Alexander himself surged ahead with his companion cavalry. Bucephalus pounding through the shallows, he clashed with Persian nobles in glittering armor, swords flashing in the sunlight. In a fierce duel, Alexander's helmet was struck, nearly splitting his skull. But he rose, striking his enemy down with a fatal blow. His men, inspired by his fearlessness, pushed harder. By day's end, the Persians broke. The satraps fled, leaving the field to Alexander. Asia Minor now lay open before him. The world saw that the young king was no mere prince of Macedon. He was a conqueror destined to rival the gods. After the thunderous victory at the Granicus, Alexander swept across Asia Minor. The Persian satraps were scattered, their forces broken. And one by one, the great cities of Ionia opened their gates. In Ephesus, priests and citizens lined the streets, showering Alexander with flowers. They hailed him not as a conqueror, but as a savior who had freed them from Persian tribute. In Miletus, the Persian garrison was expelled, the people chanting his name as he entered the agora. At Halicarnassus, the Persian stronghold resisted fiercely, its towering walls defying his assaults. But after months of siege, Alexander's engines breached the defenses, and the city fell, its defenders crushed or scattered to the sea. Everywhere he marched, Alexander proclaimed freedom for the Greeks of Asia. He restored their democracies, abolished Persian taxes, and honored their temples. To them, he was not just a king of Macedon but the champion of Hellenism itself. Yet even amid celebration, Alexander's ambition grew. His eyes turned farther east. Asia Minor was only the beginning. The Persian heartland still awaited. For the first time, his men began to sense that their leader was not content with victory. He sought immortality with Asia Minor secured. Alexander pressed farther east. The Persian Empire stretched before him like a vast ocean, and he, a single spark, intended to set it ablaze. His men marched through Anatolia's rugged mountains and scorching plains, their bronze armor shimmering under the relentless sun. Every step carried them farther from home. Yet Alexander's charisma kept their spirits high. He rode at the head of the column, crimson cloaks snapping in the wind, speaking to soldiers by name, reminding them that together they carried Greece into history. The Persians, however, were not idle. King Darius III, realizing the threat, began gathering a massive host from across his empire. Rumors reached Alexander's camp of endless cavalry, war chariots with scythed wheels, and gold flowing like rivers to fuel Persia's war machine. Still, the young king's confidence never wavered. At night, Alexander studied maps by torchlight, tracing the routes of rivers and mountain passes. He knew the final confrontation was near. Every city captured, every satrap defeated, was but a step toward the moment when he would look Darius in the eye on the battlefield. The army pressed south, their boots stirring clouds of dust as they neared the narrow coastal plain of Issus. The stage was set. The greatest empire in the world was about to meet the will of a single man. In Sambai-Sanchosan BCE, the narrow coastal plain of Issus became the crucible where east met west. On one side stood Alexander's siege, Ling troops, hardened by victory, their bronze phalanx glinting in the morning sun. On the other side stretched the vast might of Darius III, commanding an army many times greater, archers, cavalry, mercenaries, and the king himself, enthroned in splendor. The battlefield was cramped between mountains and sea, nullifying much of Persia's numerical advantage. Alexander seized the moment. He placed his phalanx in the center, anchoring the line, while he led the companion cavalry on the right. The battle began with a clash of arrows and the grinding advance of spears. The Macedonian phalanx met wave after wave of Persian infantry, their long sarissas forming a living wall. On the flank, Alexander spurred Bucephalus forward, driving his cavalry like a thunderbolt into the Persians. Through the chaos, Alexander spotted Darius's chariot, surrounded by bodyguards. With eyes blazing, he drove straight at the Persian king. For a heartbeat, two worlds locked gazes, the youthful conqueror and the great king of Persia. Fear broke Darius's will. He turned his chariot and fled, his army collapsing in terror. By nightfall, the Persians were in full retreat. The camp of Darius was seized, his family captured, and Alexander stood victorious. The world now knew Persia's king could run, but Alexander would never stop. After the chaos of Issus, Alexander entered the captured camp of Darius III. There, among silks, gold, and abandoned treasures, he found something far more delicate: the family of the great king himself. In a richly adorned tent sat Darius's mother, wife, and daughters, veiled in sorrow. They feared the worst: humiliation, slavery, or death at the hands of a ruthless conqueror. Word spread that they wept uncontrollably, believing Alexander would treat them as spoils of war. But when Alexander arrived, his demeanor was not of a barbarian despoiler, but of a king who understood the weight of honor. Entering the tent still armored, cloak blood-stained from battle, he approached the royal family with a calm dignity. Bowing slightly, he addressed them not as captives, but as royalty. He assured them their honor would remain intact, that no harm would come to them, and that they would be treated as queens, not prisoners. This act of magnanimity shocked the world. Where Darius had fled, abandoning his own kin, Alexander had shown mercy. He visited them often, speaking kindly, and allowed them to maintain their attendance and comforts. To his soldiers, this mercy was unexpected. To his enemies, it was terrifying. For Alexander proved he could conquer, not only with steel, but with grace and restraint, bending hearts as easily as armies. This moment elevated his legend. The young king was not only a warrior of fire, but a leader who carried himself as if touched by the gods. After Issus, Alexander pressed relentlessly onward. Darius had fled east, but before pursuing him into Mesopotamia, Alexander turned south, his eyes fixed on Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs and gods, still under Persian control. The journey took him through the Phoenician coast, where cities like Tyre and Gaza resisted bitterly. Tyre's island citadel, defiant and proud, endured a brutal 7-month siege before Alexander's engineers finally bridged the sea and stormed its walls. At Gaza, high fortifications delayed him, yet he prevailed, though wounded in the shoulder during the assault. By the time he entered Egypt in Sembite Century BCE, the people no longer saw him as a foreign invader. To them, Alexander was a liberator from Persian rule. At Memphis, priests, nobles, and citizens greeted him with chants and offerings. He restored temples, honored their gods, and even sacrificed to Apis, the sacred bull. In recognition, the Egyptians hailed him as Pharaoh of Egypt, the son of the divine. For Alexander, this was not just political victory. It was a union with Dapt, an ancient civilization that would forever enshrine his name in stone. Though hailed as Pharaoh, Alexander sought something greater, divine legitimacy. Hearing of the oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis in the Libyan desert, he set out across scorching sands with only a small escort. The desert was merciless. Winds whipped sand into walls. Supplies ran low, and mirages shimmered on the horizon. Yet Alexander pressed on, convinced the gods themselves guided his path. At last, he arrived at the temple of Ammon, whose priests were famed for channeling the god's voice. Draped in sacred robes, the high priest welcomed Alexander into the sanctuary. What was spoken within remained secret, but rumors spread like wildfire. The oracle had addressed him not as mortal king, but as son of Ammon, a god in human form. When Alexander emerged, his soldiers gazed at him with awe. Some whispered he was more than a man. Others feared the dangerous pride this title might instill. Alexander himself remained silent, but his eyes burned with new conviction. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was chosen, divine, destined to rule the world, with Egypt secured and the oracle of Ammon proclaiming him divine. Alexander turned his gaze east again. The time for final reckoning with Darius III had come. He marched his army out of Egypt, crossing the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, the lifeblood of Mesopotamia. Scouts reported that Darius was assembling a colossal host near Gaugamela, far larger than at Issus. Rumors whispered of war elephants, scythed chariots, and soldiers from every corner of the empire, from India to Bactria, from Babylon to the Persian Gulf. The Macedonian army, though smaller, carried unshakable confidence. Veterans of countless sieges and battles, they trusted their king implicitly. As they neared the plains, Alexander drilled his troops relentlessly, preparing them for the chariots and elephants they would soon face. At night, under starlit skies, Alexander addressed his men. Before us lies the heart of Persia. One victory, and the empire is ours. Remember, it is not numbers that win battles. It is courage, discipline, and the will of the gods. Tomorrow, we seize the world. His words ignited their spirits. The Macedonian camp erupted in chants, their voices echoing across the plain as if Olympus itself approved. The fate of empires would soon be decided. On the morning of October Sembite Century BCE, the fields of Gaugamela became the stage for destiny. Darius had chosen the ground carefully, a vast plain flattened to unleash his cavalry and scythed chariots. His army, numbering perhaps Urbeg, stretched as far as the eye could see. Alexander, with barely satiety, Lingman studied the terrain with eagle-eyed precision. He extended his right flank to draw the Persians outward, creating a gap in their lines. As the Persians charged, Alexander unleashed his companion cavalry in a devastating wedge formation. The clash was thunderous. Chariots hurtled forward, their scythed wheels spinning. Macedonian soldiers opened their ranks, allowing the deadly machines to pass harmlessly before cutting down their drivers. The phalanx held firm, while Alexander struck where the Persian line bent. Then came the pivotal moment. Alexander, leading his cavalry, broke through directly toward Darius. The Persian king, once again staring into the eyes of fate, panicked. His royal guard faltered, and Darius fled the battlefield. With their king gone, the Persian host crumbled into chaos. The Macedonians had achieved the impossible. The world's greatest empire had fallen in a single day. Alexander, bloodied but unbowed, stood victorious, now master of Asia. After the crushing victory at Gaugamela, Alexander marched triumphantly into Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. Unlike cities stormed in fire and blood, Babylon opened its gates willingly. Its towering walls, ziggurats, and hanging gardens dazzled the Macedonians, who whispered in awe at the legendary city of kings. The Babylonians, weary of Persian rule, greeted Alexander as a liberator. Priests, nobles, and citizens lined the streets, showering him with garlands. The temple of Marduk, chief god of Babylon, was restored at Alexander's command, and sacrifices were in his honor. The king showed restraint, no looting, no burning. Instead, he proclaimed amnesty, preserving Babylon's wealth and splendor. In this moment, Alexander proved he was not merely a destroyer, but a ruler who understood empire. By respecting Babylon's traditions, he won the hearts of its people. The Macedonians reveled in the city's luxury, but Alexander's gaze remained forward. He knew Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, awaited, a city that symbolized the very soul of his enemy. Babylon was his prize, but Persepolis would be his throne of destiny. From Babylon, Alexander marched east, through the Zagros Mountains, toward Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. Its terraces and palaces, adorned with reliefs of kings and tribute-bearers, embodied centuries of Persian glory. When Alexander's army finally breached its gates, the wealth of the world seemed to pour before them. Halls of marble, columns stretching skyward, treasuries overflowing with gold. At first, Alexander treated Persepolis with reverence, declaring it the prize of their long struggle. But during a night of feasting, when wine flowed and torches flickered, a decision was made that would echo through history. Urged on, perhaps by his companions, perhaps by the courtesan Tyros, Alexander seized a torch and cast it upon the palace of Xerxes. Flames leapt skyward, devouring the wooden roofs, licking at carved reliefs. The city burned for days, its glory reduced to ash. Some said it was revenge for Persia's burning of Athens. Others believed it was drunken impulse. Yet the image of Persepolis ablaze became eternal. The fall of an empire, the triumph of Alexander. The young conqueror stood before the flames, face lit by fire, and though he was hailed as master of Asia, a shadow of regret flickered in his eyes. For even kings touched by the gods could not undo the wrath of fire. Persepolis smoldered in ashes. But Alexander's war was not yet complete. Darius III still lived, fleeing deeper into Persia with what remained of his loyal forces. For Alexander, as long as the great king drew breath, the conquest of Asia was unfinished. Ruthless in pursuit, he drove his army across rugged mountains and endless plains. Towns that resisted were taken, those that submitted spared, for speed was now the essence of war. At every stop, Alexander demanded news of Darius. Where has he fled? How many ride with him? The answer was always the same. Farther east, always east. Darius, abandoned by much of his empire, was reduced to a fugitives, relying on satraps who swore loyalty but whispered betrayal. Meanwhile, Alexander's relentless chase inspired awe and terror. His men followed him with iron discipline, despite exhaustion. Each day, they believed they were hunting not just a king, but destiny itself. The land itself seemed to test them. Scorching deserts by day, freezing winds by night, treacherous passes crawling with ambushes. Yet Alexander pressed on, his will unbreakable, until the hunt brought him to the fateful moment that would end Persia's line of kings. At last, in Cambyses BCE, Alexander's pursuit brought him close to his prey. But fate delivered Darius not through glorious battle, but through betrayal. In the deserts of Media, Darius's own satrap Bessus, fearing Alexander's wrath and craving power for himself, turned against his king. Darius was seized, bound, and abandoned to a cruel fate. When Alexander's scouts finally reached the site, they found the great king mortally wounded, left in a wagon, gasping for breath. Alexander rushed to him, cradling the last Achaemenid monarch in his arms. In his final moments, Darius thanked Alexander for his mercy toward his family, entrusting his empire to the young conqueror. With his last breath, the line of Persian kings ended. For Alexander, the scene was bittersweet. He had sought the glory of defeating Darius face to face, but instead found a broken, betrayed man. Yet even in death, Darius granted him legitimacy. He was no longer merely the conqueror of Persia, but its rightful heir. To honor him, Alexander ordered a royal funeral with full Persian rites and pursued Bessus with unrelenting fury. For kings may fall, but betrayal would never go unpunished under Alexander's rule. The death of Darius III did not end Alexander's fury. The betrayal of the great king by Bessus, satrap of Bactria, filled him with righteous wrath. For Alexander, it was not enough to conquer an empire. Traitors had to be punished, for treachery poisoned the very soul of kingship. Declaring himself king of kings, Bessus fled east into the remote lands of Bactria and Sogdiana. He styled himself as Artaxerxes V, attempting to claim the Persian throne. But his reign was fragile, sustained only by fear and shifting alliances. Alexander's pursuit was relentless. Through scorching deserts, over snow-laden passes, across wild rivers, he drove his men deeper into the unknown. It was not just a campaign, but a hunt. Macedonian cavalry swept through villages, demanding allegiance or swift destruction. Local satraps bent their knees, terrified of the avenger who bore both the title of Pharaoh and the blessing of Ammon. Finally, Bessus was betrayed by his own men, captured and delivered in chains to Alexander. The conqueror ordered him scourged, then sent to Ecbatana, where he was mutilated according to Persian custom, his nose and ears cut off, before being executed as the traitor who murdered his king. In this brutal act, Alexander declared to Persia and the world, betrayal would never be tolerated. He was not merely a conqueror, but the avenger of kings. With Persia's throne secured, Alexander might have rested. Yet his ambition knew no boundaries. Beyond Persia lay Central Asia, wild, unconquered lands of steppe riders, mountain tribes, and rebellious satraps. To secure his empire, he pressed eastward into Bactria and Sogdiana. The campaign was unlike any before. Here, Alexander faced not massive imperial armies, but elusive guerrilla fighters who melted into mountains and deserts. Macedonian phalanxes, so deadly on plains, now struggled in narrow valleys and icy passes. The enemy struck like shadows, swift cavalry raids by nomads, ambushes in rugged terrain, resistance led by fierce local princes. To hold these lands, Alexander founded a chain of cities, many bearing his name, Alexandria Eshate, the furthest among them. These outposts became bastions of Greek rule in foreign lands, seeds of Hellenistic culture planted on distant frontiers. Yet the campaign drained his men. Harsh winters, endless marches, and alien customs wore upon their spirits. But Alexander, relentless and radiant, drove them forward. His eyes now looked beyond Central Asia, toward the mysterious lands of India, where new kingdoms and new glories awaited. In the remote lands of Sogdiana, Alexander faced his most stubborn foes. Here the people did not surrender easily, nor march to meet him in open battle. Instead, they resisted from fortresses carved into mountains, striking in swift ambushes and retreating to strongholds beyond reach. One fortress in particular became legend, a citadel perched atop a sheer cliff, later called the Rock of Sogdiana. Its defenders mocked Alexander, shouting that only men with wings could scale its heights. Such taunts only fed the fire of the Macedonian king. He called upon his best climbers, soldiers who had scaled cliffs in past campaigns. At night, with ropes, iron spikes, and unyielding courage, they crept up the jagged walls. Many fell to their deaths. But at dawn, a small band of Macedonians appeared on the summit, waving their shields in triumph. The defenders, shocked and demoralized, surrendered without further fight. Alexander's audacity had once again defied the impossible. The Rock of Sogdiana fell, and with it the spirit of many rebels. But this campaign was not just about conquest. Fate had something more personal, waiting for the young king among these mountains. Among the captives taken after the fall of the Sogdian fortress was a noble woman whose beauty captured Alexander's heart. She was Roxana, daughter of a local chieftain, with eyes like the dark steppe skies and a spirit unbroken by defeat. She stood proud before the conqueror, refusing to cower even in chains. Alexander, so often ruthless in war, was struck by her dignity. He saw not just a prisoner, but a queen worthy of standing beside him. His companions whispered in surprise as he treated her with unusual gentleness, sparing her family and honoring her rank. In a move that astonished friend and foe alike, Alexander declared he would wed Roxana. To his Macedonians, it was a shock, their king marrying a barbarian, but to Alexander it was a union of empires, a symbol of harmony between conqueror and conquered. Their wedding was simple yet solemn. Alexander cut bread with his sword, shared it with Roxana, and drank from a golden cup. Soldiers cheered, and the people of Sogdiana saw hope for reconciliation. With Roxana by his side, Alexander's empire gained not only new lands, but also a queen whose beauty and spirit would forever mark his legend. And even after his marriage to Roxana, the mountains and steppes of Central Asia refused to bow easily. Local princes and nomadic tribes rose again and again, in rebellion, striking at Alexander's garrisons and melting into the wilderness before they could be punished. These were not grand battles like Issus or Gaugamela. They were wars of ambush and survival. Macedonian phalanxes stumbled in narrow gorges, while horse archers harassed them with clouds of arrows. Whole towns rose in revolt, forcing Alexander to march tirelessly from one stronghold to the next, stamping out defiance like sparks on dry grass. Yet Alexander never wavered. He adopted the tactics of his enemies: swift cavalry raids, lightning strikes at night, and relentless pursuit. His victories were measured, not in glorious parades, but in hard-won silence as valleys fell still after weeks of resistance. These campaigns hardened Alexander's men. They had conquered empires. Now they learned to master the chaos of guerrilla war. To Alexander, every rebellion crushed was not just survival. It was the proof that no force, no land, no tribe, could resist his will to hold the frontier. Alexander built not only with the sword, but with stone. In Sembite Asajo BCE, he founded Alexandria Eschate, the furthest Alexandria on the banks of the river Jaxartes. Modern Syra, this city was no mere outpost. It was a declaration that Hellenism itself had reached the edge of the world. Stone walls rose where grass once swayed, markets opened where nomads once camped, and Greek settlers mingled uneasily with Central Asian tribes. No. But the foundation of the city was not peaceful. Nomadic Scythians, alarmed by this foreign intrusion, launched raids across the river. They were fierce horsemen, unmatched in archery, swooping in and vanishing into the endless steppe. Alexander responded with brilliance. He lured them into battle near the river, then used his phalanx and cavalry in tandem to trap them. The Scythians were crushed, and their leaders forced to sue for peace. Alexandria Eschat stood firm, a Greek beacon planted on the furthest edge of the known world. For Alexander, it was more than strategy. It was destiny, proof that even the wildest frontiers would carry his name. With Central Asia subdued, Alexander's gaze turned further east, toward the mysterious land whispered of by traders, India. Tales of vast rivers, mighty elephants, and powerful kings stirred his imagination. But before marching, he consolidated his power. He married local customs with Greek rule, placing loyal satraps over provinces, garrisoning cities, and weaving bonds between conqueror and conquered. His marriage to Roxana became a symbol of unity. Though many Macedonians still grumbled in private, in Sambai Arshasti BCE, Alexander led his army across the Hindu Kush, a perilous mountain range of icy peaks and narrow passes. Soldiers froze in blizzards, supplies dwindled, yet the king pressed forward with unyielding determination. To his men, it seemed as though their commander sought to outpace the very horizon. At last, they descended into the fertile lands of the Indus Valley. Here, Alexander would face new challenges, kingdoms unlike Persia, rulers who refused to bow, and beasts the Greeks had never seen. War elephants. The world's edge was behind him. The unknown now lay ahead. For Alexander, it was not enough to rule Persia. He would chase glory to the ends of the earth. As Alexander's army crossed into India, they found themselves in lands unlike anything they had seen before. The air was humid, heavy with scents of unknown flowers. Thick forests covered the hills, hiding swift tribes who refused submission. These warriors struck from shadows, vanishing before Macedonian spears could touch them. Alexander knew that before he could confront the mighty kings of India, he must break the resistance of the highland tribes. The campaign was brutal. The Macedonians scaled cliffs under blazing suns, fought in narrow valleys where arrows rained from above, and stormed hill forts hid. One fort perched on a towering crag resisted fiercely. Alexander himself led the assault, scaling ladders under a storm of arrows. His shield was struck, his cloak torn, but he refused to fall back. When the gates finally splintered, the defenders were cut down, their resistance silenced by Macedonian steel. To the tribes, Alexander was a relentless storm. To his men, he was both inspiration and burden, for he demanded they march ever forward into an unknown world that seemed endless. As Alexander's army crossed into India, they found themselves in lands unlike anything they had seen before. The air was humid, heavy with scents of unknown flowers. Thick forests covered the hills, hiding swift tribes who refused submission. These warriors struck from shadows, vanishing before Macedonian spears could touch them. Alexander knew that before he could confront the mighty kings of India, he must break the resistance of the highland tribes. The campaign was brutal. The Macedonians scaled cliffs under blazing suns, fought in narrow valleys where arrows rained from above, and stormed hill forts hidden among. One fort, perched on a towering crag, resisted fiercely. Alexander himself led the assault, scaling ladders under a storm of arrows. His shield was struck, his cloak torn, but he refused to fall back. When the gates finally splintered, the defenders were cut down, their resistance silenced by Macedonian steel. To the tribes, Alexander was a relentless storm. To his men, he was both inspiration and burden, for he demanded they march ever forward into an unknown world that seemed endless. In Sembite Arcelope BCE, Alexander made his move. Under cover of night and storm, he led a select force upstream, where the river curved and islands broke the current. Boats and rafts were launched silently into the darkness. At dawn, Alexander's troops burst onto the far bank, catching Porus by surprise. But Porus did not falter. His war elephants thundered forward, tusks armored, towers strapped to their backs. Arrows rained from archers perched high above. Macedonian horses panicked at the beasts' roars, throwing riders into the mud. For a moment, defeat seemed near, yet Alexander he ordered his phalanx to spread out, spears stabbing at the elephants' legs while archers targeted the mahouts. Cavalry swept in from the flanks, encircling the Indian infantry. Slowly, chaos turned to triumph. Porus fought bravely, towering on his elephant, refusing to yield even as his army broke. When at last he was wounded and captured, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. The proud king replied, "As a king." Admiring his courage, Alexander granted Porus not only mercy, but his throne, as a loyal ally under Macedonian rule. The Battle of Hydaspes was both terror and glory. It cemented the smoke of Hydaspes still lingered when Alexander ordered a new city built on the banks of the river. He named it Nicaea, Victory, in honor of the triumph over Porus. Not far away, another city rose, Bucephala, named for his beloved stallion Bucephalus, who had died in the battle after carrying Alexander through countless campaigns. With the loss of Bucephalus pierced Alexander's heart more deeply than any wound. He walked beside the horse's body, silent, while soldiers looked on in mourning. To immortalize his companion, he decreed the founding of a city that would forever bear Bucephalus's name. For the king who dreamed of immortality, this was his offering of love and gratitude. Yet even amid grief, the work of empire pressed on. The new cities became bastions of Macedonian power, filled with soldiers, settlers, and traders. Markets buzzed with Greek and Indian voices mingling, while temples rose to both Zeus and local gods. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that Alexander's vision of a blended world was taking root in the fertile plains of India. But behind the celebrations, murmurs stirred in the army. They had marched farther than any Greeks before them. Their victories were glorious, but their homes felt impossibly distant. Whispers of fatigue began to rise. From the Hydaspes, Alexander pressed eastward, determined to reach the Ganges River, the fabled heart of India. He spoke of new kingdoms to conquer, new rivers to cross, and new cities to found. But his men no longer cheered his vision. The monsoons lashed them with endless rains. Roads became rivers of mud. Armor rusted, supplies rotted. Strange beasts prowled the jungles, and unfamiliar diseases spread through the camp. For the first time, the Macedonian veterans, hardened by decades of victory, began to falter. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, modern Bees, Alexander gathered his troops. He declared that they stood on the threshold of new glory, of lands richer than any they had yet seen. His voice thundered with passion, but the faces before him were grim and silent. When the general spoke, they voiced the will of the men. They would march no further, For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to yield. His dream of reaching the end of the world met the unbreakable wall of his army's exhaustion. He wept in fury and frustration, but at last he turned back. The march of conquest had reached its limit, defeated not by enemies but by his own army's resolve. Alexander turned back, yet retreat did not mean weakness. It meant conquest in reverse. As the Macedonians descended the Indus River, Alexander's fury unleashed itself upon tribes that defied him. Battles flared along the riverbanks. In one siege, Alexander was gravely wounded when an arrow pierced his lung. Blood filled his chest, and for days his army feared their king would die. Yet, against all odds, Alexander recovered, showing himself to the troops from a litter, pale but alive. Their cheers thundered. Relief mingled with renewed devotion. To secure his path, Alexander ordered ships built and floated his army downriver. Villages blazed, new garrisons rose, and the Indus Valley was bound to his empire. The dream of India's conquest was curtailed, but not extinguished. In Sambi-Asa BCE, Alexander chose the most brutal route home, the Gedrosian Desert, modern Makron. He sought to outdo Cyrus the Great, who had once failed to cross it. But the desert was merciless. Day after day, soldiers staggered under a sun that turned the earth to fire. Water was scarce, food scarcer. Thousands collapsed in the burning sands. Horses died by the hundreds. Even Alexander, who marched on foot to share his men's suffering, could not shield them from the desert's wrath. In one moment of legend, a small group of soldiers brought the king a helmet filled with water. Instead of drinking, Alexander poured it into the sand before them. "If my men cannot drink, neither shall I." His men wept, strengthened by his sacrifice, but the desert still devoured them by the thousands. By the time they staggered out, the army was broken, yet alive. Their ordeal became as legendary as any battle. At last, Alexander reached Babylon in Sambi-Asa BCE. The city welcomed him as more than a king. He was hailed as a living god. Festivals lit the night sky. Envoys from across the known world knelt before him, and plans were drawn for new campaigns. To Arabia, perhaps even to the edges of Africa, Alexander's vision had grown beyond empire. It was now of a single world, united under his rule. He encouraged mass marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen, blending bloodlines as he had blended cultures. Yet the harmony he dreamed of sparked discontent. Macedonian veterans grumbled, uneasy at his fusion of East and West. Still, in Babylon, Alexander stood at the height of his power. The world lay at his feet. His dream seemed unbreakable, but fate was already moving against him. In June Sambi-Asa BCE, Babylon hosted a great banquet in Alexander's honor. Music filled the halls, golden goblets overflowed, and laughter rang through the night. Yet behind the joy lingered tension. Conspiracies whispered, and shadows lengthened around the young king. After drinking heavily, Alexander was struck with sudden fever. Day after day, his condition worsened. His generals, the companions who had followed him across the world, gathered at his bedside. Some suspected poison, others believed the gods themselves had struck him down. Unable to speak, Alexander gestured for his signet ring to be given to Perdiccas, one of his trusted officers. When asked to whom he left his empire, legend claims he whispered only, "To the strongest." As the fever consumed him, Alexander's soldiers filed past his bed, weeping, kissing his hand, praying for a miracle. Their immortal king was slipping away. On June 10, BCE, in the palace of Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was only Sansha'ar years old. The world once united in his hands, fractured at his passing. Yet his death did not erase his dream. The empire he forged stretched from Greece to India. His cities, more than 20, carried his name. His vision of blending East and West lingered for centuries, shaping cultures and kingdoms long after his body lay still. His generals, the Diadochi, would tear the empire apart in bloody wars, but none would match his brilliance. To his soldiers, he remained the immortal king. To history, he became the measure of greatness itself. Roxana wept, carrying his unborn child. The world grieved, and in the silence that followed, legends grew. Some claimed he was taken by poison, others by the gods, but all agreed Alexander had conquered not just lands, but eternity. And so the dream ends. A boy who once saw the world at his feet became a man who bent it to his will. From the plains of Macedonia to the deserts of Persia, from the temples of Egypt to the rivers of India, Alexander carved a path of brilliance, courage, and relentless ambition. Yet for all his victories, he was still mortal. His body succumbed to time, but his vision did not. The cities he founded, the cultures he blended, and the legends he inspired continue to echo across centuries. Even now, his name stands as a symbol of what it means to strive beyond the horizon, to reach for the impossible. Alexander's story is not merely one of conquest. It is a tale of humanity's unquenchable desire to dream bigger, to see farther, to become more. He reminds us that greatness is not measured only by the lands we claim, but by the vision we leave behind. Though the king is gone, the dream remains. A dream of unity, of ambition, and of the eternal fire that drives us to reach beyond ourselves. Alexander lived as a conqueror. He died as a legend. He endures as a dream,